Women in the 21st century don't often think of just how lucky they are to live in an era where women have equal rights as men. The women of the medieval era were not so fortunate, which is why I have chosen the topic to research the women healers and midwives of the medieval ages. In the height of the medieval era, women were subservient to their men, oftentimes working both in their homes as well as in lower paid positions out in the fields. Both men and women were completely ruled and governed by the church and state. The Bible and religion were the beginning and end in every aspect of medieval life, because the church held such high power. To do anything other than what the church preached was sinful and risked persecution. One such belief that the church held were that peasants whom fell ill or diseased were considered to be sinners, and it must be the Lord's wish for them to suffer and even die. The church would merely preach to them, but deny them any medical aid. Physicians were strictly reserved for those of nobility. The ruling classes were deeply intertwined with the church and held equal power. Thus, the majority of humanity was left untreated and could only be saved by the healing powers of the Lord if they would repent their sins. Therefore, there were a large number of untreated peasants in the village who were in need of treatment and care. Despite the church's wishes, many peasant women began to fill these positions as healers. Out of experience, many women became midwives and assisted the other women through childbirth. Others became healers as well, with use of herbs, folk remedies, incantations and healing beliefs. While midwifery was deemed okay, expanding beyond the scope of childbirth became a subject of much persecution to the women. This persecution largely stemmed from sexism. At this time in history, only men were allowed into universities where they could be educated to become doctors. Men began to view women healers as a threat to their profession. Thus, the suppression of women in medicine began. The church condoned the suppression because it was their belief that women had evil thoughts when allowed to think for themselves. The women healers, called wise women, began to be known as witches or charlatans by authorities and ruling social classes. As Professor Lohr explained in lecture, men felt threatened by these women who were capable to bring new life into the world. Especially if the church was uninvolved, these religious men believed that the newborn was not safe until it was in a man's hands, and quickly baptized by the church to ensure salvation. So, you can begin to see why women in midwifery were quickly accused of blasphemy of the church. Therefore, these wise women became a triple threat to the men in medieval society. Firstly, she was a woman. Next, she appeared to have an organized, underground group made up of peasant women. And lastly, she based her signs off of empirical evidence, not religious beliefs. These women relied on their senses, and the process of trial and error. Actively inquiring, they did not explain away causes because it is God's will. Instead, they trusted their abilities to heal through whatever form possible, whether that be medications or charms. These women set the stage for the scientific thinking process of our time. But, because of the threats these women imposed to the church and the state, regardless if they were saving lives, they must be in cohorts with the devil. The church, as well as the medical profession, set out to eradicate these female healers, or as known to them, witches. The European medical profession validated the hunt for these witches by imposing their so-called medical judgment to determine who were witches. Even male doctors in this time in history did more harm than good, largely because their practices were still religion-based. Male doctors only studied theories and were not allowed to make medical decisions or treatment without a priest. So, their judgment of these so-called witches, once again, reverts back to the church. The manner in which they decided what women were witches was based off of a few broad ideas. Any woman who expressed any female sexuality, displayed possible organization with other peasant women, or who practiced any type of medicine, especially empirically. These were the women who fell under attack, whether legitimate healers or not. These women were also accused of giving contraceptive aids as well as performing abortions. These men also went to the extent of believing that these witches were capable of making men infertile and could dismember them with their magic. Out of fear and ignorance, men executed, usually by burning at the stake, upwards to 1,000,000 women, young, old and even children were murdered. Quoting an article by Ehrenreich and English, it was a calculated ruling class campaign of terrorization, The first execution was performed in 1647. This initiated the entire slew of executions that followed. While the women did go through court trials, there was lack of evidence to support their possible innocence. The trials and witch hunts began to spread across the world, where it began in the heart of Europe and spread as far as the United States. This continued for more than 4 centuries while more and more women were executed. These trials resulted in the degradation of women and subsequent nurses of the modern times. Some would say the medieval period helped to create the male-dominant healthcare field that exists today. After the trials ended, women were continuously pushed out of medicine. Midwifery even became illegal in most areas of the world. Male doctors continued to fight to keep their supposed scientific knowledge to themselves and keep women untrained, and only in the menial work in healthcare that they did not wish to do. Slowly, this evolved into the nursing positions of today. Of course, in recent years, a career in nursing has advanced tremendously and more women are advancing through the healthcare field. Still, although some argue that the oppression through the medieval era has created the patriarchal nature of the medical field. For example, 93% of doctors in the US are men. True or not, the peasant women healers during the medieval times faced more turmoil and torture than any other time in history. This torture was a direct result of the strong grasp that the Roman Catholic Church held on society and the belief that women were inherently evil. The political struggle of women encroaching on the men's medical territory also played a large role into the terror that reigned through these medieval times. No one knows the exact struggles that these women endured because they were not allowed to learn to read and write. So, all we know about the trials is the side of the literate ruling class that performed the persecutions. So, the topic of their so-called witchcraft is still a little mysterious. From what we can conceive of it, these women were actually ahead of their time and were more medically sound than their male doctor counterparts at this time. Some of the herbal remedies they conjured are still in use today, so their persecution was largely due to sexism and religious ideals, all of which have created a deeply rooted idea as to whom should be at the top of medical professions of today. So, next time you are in the doctor's office, consider this presentation and think back to a time where women actually ruled the medical profession. Regardless if it was underground, these women saved many peasant lives and learned to think for themselves and not by the church. You might even call it one of the first women's movements in history. Thank you for listening to my presentation on the healing women of the medieval era. I hope you enjoyed it.